We now have a world in which all the great empires have been completely removed. The remaining nations who used to be colonies now are fighting for independence. It's a huge wave across the world. The French and the British, especially, and the Italians, begin to give independence. Whether willfully or unwillingly, they have to give independence. And so there's now a huge population of nations who are newly independent. The Americans are moving around trying to find as many allies as possible across the world. But at the same time, past 45, so after World War II, 1945, America is a superpower. But the Soviet bloc is also a superpower. So the Russians come back, and they are a counterweight to the American superpower. So both of these are new superpowers. And they're fighting another war. It's not World War III, it's called the Cold War. Because in the next 40 to 45 years, these two empires are going to go around the world recruiting allies, fighting wars, proxy wars, and trying to beat the other in any possible way. Technologically, socially, intellectually, economically, they are completely at war on all fronts for the next 40-45 years. And in the process of doing that, many nations fall foul of their influence. The Middle East has many challenges because, first of all, it is oil rich. For the most part, the Gulf region is very oil rich. It has a huge population, and it is the bridge between the East and the West. It is the bridge, it is the buffer between the East, Russia and China, and the West, continental Europe, and the rest of that part. So the Middle East, as the name says it, is the barrier, the battleground. And so you could imagine both parties worked very hard to recruit nations to join their cause. For a period of time, the socialists were actually more influential because they had Egypt, they had Syria, they had Iraq, they had parts of Yemen, southern Yemen, they had the Horn of Africa. So they were and parts of Lebanon, they were very influential. So Dr. Abdullah says, the situation at the time was one of a clash between Western capitalism and Soviet communism. The Soviets succeeded in convincing many of the Arab states to accept their corrupt ideology. And as I said before, they would accept it, but also they'd have fatwa produced. When Nasser came to power, he institutionalized Al-Azhar. When Nasser came to power, Al-Azhar became a state organ. It became a part of the state's apparatus. So he could churn out fatwa as he wished. He got compliance. When we find, for example, people such as 𝗎𝙘𝗎𝗎𝗔𝗍 in her book, Return of the Pharaoh, a wonderful book, she says when Nasser began to apply pressure on the du'at and the shuyukh, we had two types of da'wah. We had the sweet da'wah and the bitter da'wah. The sweet da'wah became one wherein you would try your best to comply with whatever Nasser and the establishment was going for. You complied fully. You gave da'wah according to what the government, the dawla wanted, the nidhamiyya wanted. Whatever the system wants, you comply basically. You become an agent of the state. And she says many people who were sincere initially eventually lost the will and became conformists. And then there was a bitter da'wah. And that was the one that only few people can sustain. That was to remain principled and not to compromise yourself in the face of immense torture, pain, and punishment. To remain principled. That was a bitter da'wah. She says in that day and age, most of those who she used to work with, her colleagues in the da'wah, turned against her and took the sweet da'wah. Yeah? So there's no wonder why many of these Arab states then flipped and joined the Soviets when they had the state-sponsored fatwa being printed, being churned out. The ideology of communism came into the Arab world under the guise of socialism. So there is a distinction between socialism and communism. We're not going to get into it now. But communism is a more complete, a more authoritarian form of socialism. Socialism effectively, and there are some, for example, the Ba'athi Party, the Ba'ath Party, Arab Nationalist Party, they were socialist, not communist. So even amongst themselves, there was a distinction between socialist and communist. The communists are the more extreme form. They want to go all the way, right? So there was a distinction. So they came to the Middle East with socialism, the milder brand, and they produced that as a proposal, and people took it. That's why Nasir was a socialist. Arab socialism. Arab Islamic socialism in certain books is Arab Islamic socialism because they halalified it, but Arab socialism was a broad umbrella under which this was presented. And it was simple. Equality across the board. We don't want to have a class system. We want to have equality for everybody. No imperialism, no colonization. Freedom for everyone, okay, and prosperity. So in Iraq, it came along. Of course, it came into Iraq, and they became an ally to the Russians, which was very useful when they started wars against, for example, their neighbors. They had the weapons from the Russians. The Ba'ath, as I mentioned before, they also took the ideology. It was an Arab nationalist socialist movement. The Ba'ath was an Arab nationalist socialist movement. It goes on to say this infectious disease also afflicted Syria, such that the socialist motto spread amongst the all strata of society: unity, freedom, socialism. Unity, freedom, socialism. In southern Yemen, because Yemen was always in a state of conflict between the north and the south. In southern Yemen, they also became communist. Okay? And this way, communism under the guise of socialism entered the Middle East. And all of these nations had white power: weapons, help, intelligence, technology, and endorsement. That was very useful if you're going to fight your neighbor who doesn't have that sort of backing. And if we all have the sort of same backing, at least a protection against somebody else transgressing. So it enters into the Middle East, and we have in that epoch many Russian printed propaganda pieces. So here you have a Russian printed propaganda piece, basically to repel the invaders in Russian. Here you have an Arab, traditional Arab, and he is pushing away with his arms Britain and France and their warships. Okay, propaganda piece right there. Then here we have, of course, the Rush, but it's in Arabic, okay? Celebrating, and within the masses, you have Arabs with Europeans, right? You have Arabs and you have Indians. So this unified kind of society, classless society, you have the transcriptions here in Arabic, okay? So propaganda is rife and prevalent. Then we have Nasir, who was the epitome of Arab socialism. He has his own school, Nasserite socialism, which is a combination of Arabism, nationalism, socialism, and some Islam in there. So he had his own school, and he became the face and the poster child of Arab nationalist socialism. For a while, it was a big thing. In the Arab world. In the same way, some of us are excited with the ICJ or the UN or the BRICS, and we think this is the way forward. In their day and age, socialism was the way forward. Arab socialism was the way forward because it had managed to unite Arab blocs. So for example, in the 50s, you had the United Arab Republic. This was Syria. This was Egypt. For some time, it was Yemen was supposed to enter, and also Iraq was supposed to be part of that. So these four powerful blocs of Arab nations were supposed to come together under one, all under socialism. You also had the wars against Israel, who were all under the coalition of Arab nations. Most of them were socialist. So it had a lot of momentum, a lot of promise. Right? Don't look at those who were in that generation as people who are lost. No. They saw in this movement potential, economic, military, social, nationalistic, cultural potential. And this could be what brings us to a point where we become superpower ourselves. Right? But again, we know what happens in the end. It doesn't succeed. It fails miserably. And we move on to the next ideology. We now want to be democracies. So we move on to the next thing. Okay. So propaganda galore. Here we have again, because the Russians and the Europeans, subconsciously, the Arab is the more. Okay. So the Arab is the black. For them, more black is almost synonymous with Arab or Muslim. So another picture by the Russians, and this is "Do not strangle freedom." Okay, in Russian, do not strangle freedom. So this is the West trying to, again, there's a dollar sign here, right? They're trying to strangle the freedom of, and here you have the pound. So the Britain and France are seeking to strangle the economic freedom and independence of Arab nations. Okay? So very powerful imagery. And by the way, the art, the posters from Soviet propaganda is actually sold today because it was really elegant, it's beautiful. Right? It's actually, in artistic terms, very beautiful art. So you can buy posters, they actually sell them. There are websites just for these posters, propaganda from back in those days. And then we have the most powerful, important, which was to utilize the liberation struggle of the Palestinian cause. That was one of the most potent ways to recruit people into socialism. That was one of the most potent ways to recruit people into socialism. The PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, was a Marxist socialist organization. It wasn't an Islamic organization. That came into it later on when Hamas in 87 became an organization. They began as a charity. They became a political entity in 87. That's when Islam was brought into the struggle, officially at that level, when Islam came into it. Prior to that, it was socialism, Marxism, nationalism, Arabism. That's what was driving the struggle up until then. And that's the reason why Azzam left the PLO. He did not want to die for a nationalistic socialist cause. He said, it's not worth my life. The Arabs were lost, effectively, looking for an identity. The socialists gave them an identity and a cause to fight for. But it was also very convenient that they were fighting Israel, which was an imperialist project. So amazing, an amazing way to recruit people for the cause. And of course, as we know, when the PLO were in Lebanon, and when they were first in Jordan, and they sought to dethrone King Hussein, you could see them reading the Red Book of Mao, his Red Book. They were studying, rather than the Quran. It wasn't Quran, Masahif, it was the Book of Mao, the Red Book. It was mandatory reading, men, women, and children. So this is how popular movements are co-opted by ideas foreign to Islam. Even to this very day, I look at the posters, I look very carefully. At the bottom, socialist organizations always behind it, for those at least in London, because it has an evocative and a very, very powerful pull to pull you in. Equality, freedom, liberation, anti-imperialism, against America, against Russia, against Britain. Let's fight for freedom. But below that, there's another motive, against religion altogether. That they don't tell you that when they're recruiting you, but implied in that is against religion altogether. And Islam is not exempt. Yeah. So the Middle East is conquered that way. Most of the nations become socialist. But eventually they, for example, Egypt was a key member because it was the most populous Arab nation and the most dynamic. Wherever Egypt went, the other Arab nations would have to follow, or would have to counter. So when Egypt became socialist under Nasser, they all pretty much became socialist. And when he dies, in 72, Sadat removes everything with the October Papers, and he goes to the West. He switches to the West. Okay, so we have a new day and age in 72. Now in East Africa, we have, the Horn of Africa has, you have Ethiopia, you have Eritrea, and you have Somalia. Pre-World War I, pre-World War II, and even pre the Cold War, these nations were really beautiful. And again, many stories from people who were alive at the time will tell you. Beautiful places, beautiful, a lot of resources. Ethiopia was the only nation in Africa that was never colonized. And the only nation in modern history to have conquered, to have defeated in the battlefield, a Western colonial nation, in the Battle of Adwa. The only nation of the subjugated nations, or those who were being subjugated, to have defeated on the battlefield a Western colonial nation when they defeated the Italians at Adwa, Battle of Adwa. So it was known as a beautiful region. Somalia at the time, or Mogadishu, which was known as in international space is known as the White Pearl of the Indian Ocean. It was a beautiful place, right? Beautiful place. And the images you can find online still, the people, the costumes, the white houses, the greenery, and the blue sea, just beautiful. And it was known as the beautiful, or the White Pearl of the Indian Ocean. It was also a trading hub, because from there you could travel across into Africa, mainland Africa, into Asia, into Arabia. So it was very well connected at the intersection of many trading routes by sea. The Somali navigators and sailors were very well known as well. In East London, I believe, there's a part of East London, and there's also in north towards Liverpool, there are communities where Somali sailors settled very early on, because they were already being hired as navigators and guides for their sailing skills and competencies. We have, for example, in the Middle Age, we have Siad of Mogadishu, very famous. He traveled to India, he traveled to China, he spoke Chinese, he traveled everywhere, and he became the first ambassador. So there were people known for seafaring. They were well known for seafaring, and they had this ability to trade as well. Trading and seafaring combined. And so Mogadishu at the time became a very beautiful place. In fact, some of the etymology suggests that it was actually known as 𝗃𝙗𝙗𝙇 𝙗. Maq'ad, the seating place of the Shah. The Persian Empire was, they had connections with everyone. So before colonialism, before communism, it was a beautiful place, right? And the same can be said of Asmara in Eritrea. Also a beautiful place. There were actually a melange of Mediterranean cultures, Arab culture, African culture. So there's a mixture. There are some videos you watch today of people who go to Asmara, and you have, for example, ice cream gelato vans from Italy, of course. Pasta, but also at the same time food and rice that resembles the food and rice in the Middle East, for example, and clothing and traditions from Africa. So it's a beautiful blend of all these customs and cultures. Today is known as the North Korea of Africa. Today is known as the North Korea of Africa. And then Somalia as well. Okay, so these are places, and then Ethiopia. Okay, Ethiopia, we know today the water is the river and the waters of Ethiopia are being sold to the Arab Gulf nations. We look at Sudan, what's happening. That entire region effectively is destabilized, and what used to be a beautiful place, a wonderful place, a proud place, is now being undermined with wars, civil wars, and just all the resources being sucked out. All of that comes as a result of the communist wave. Not all of it, but most of it. And we're going to see how that develops, unfortunately, in the 90s. So the East African coast, effectively, the Horn of Africa, accepts communism. It opens the door to communism. All three open the door to communism. But the greatest impact was in Somalia. So Dr. Abdullah Hazzam says that the Soviets continued their relentless and ruthless advance, and they recruited Somalia. Said Barre, he writes, Ziad Barre by Said Barre, basically came to power, and he began to establish a communist socialist government, and that was effectively the beginning of what we know as the modern state of Somalia, in the state it's left in. But in the very early phases, there were Muslim scholars who tried to resist, right? Who tried to resist this new communist socialist government. And what he did was, he gathered these scholars and he burned them alive. Okay? He burned them publicly. This is a story I've heard many times. Many times I've heard this story. People have recounted the stories again and again. Some details change, the numbers, for example, change. But he set a precedence when those scholars, Islamic scholars, who stood up and said, no, we will not accept communism in our land, he gathered those people and he burned them alive. Okay? So that was the beginning of effectively a terrible ordeal that would not only take over Somalia and displace millions of people, Eritrea and Ethiopia as well. And amongst themselves, you'd have wars. They would have wars amongst themselves. So that was really the end, the beginning of the end He began to implement a one-party state based on Marxist-Leninist principles. Yeah. So he began to effectively, and there were many elders from that epoch who were socialists. If you speak to them today, they're in a masjid, they have a topi, they have a kufi, they have a long beard, mashallah, they're praying. But when they were younger, they were socialists. They were Marxists. That was the flavor of the age at the time. There we are. History and heritage and infrastructure and everything, unfortunately. Well, what was appealing with the socialist or communist propaganda was they would always tell you, we are against the imperialist powers. We're against colonization, we're against subjugation, we're against the West, generally speaking. Most of these men were young officers or young activists at the time. And of course it's appealing, we're going to go against the establishment, right? The communists would provide, again, white power, weapons, help, intelligence, technology, and endorsement. So most of these groups came through revolutions and coups. For example, Said Barre came through a coup. Okay? They came through that way, and they were then empowered and endorsed to remain in power. However, in the case of Said Barre, eventually he would kind of he would cut ties with the socialists because they began to support with the Russians, the Soviets, because they began to support Ethiopia, which was at war with Somalia. So again, you're on the same team, but you're fighting one another, and so there's a proliferation. You need weapons, he needs weapons, you use it against one another. And eventually there were videos of him saying, warning the Soviet Union to stay out of the regional conflicts. Warning them, stay out of regional conflicts, don't get involved. Okay.
It is quite clear, I think, if, for example, your act or attitude is danger to your very existence, it is logic. How can you have a good relation? So we were saying to our friends Soviet Union to consider their activities in the area, particularly in Ethiopia. It is posing dangerous to the very existence of Somalia. So to think it over. About the whole area, but particularly to the Somali Democratic Republic. In accordance to our information, the armament that Ethiopia received is unnecessary in quality and in quantity, and very dangerous to the area. I said in quantity and in quality because many of them are so sophisticated, which non-African people possess. Neither Arab people, I think, possess such arms. I don't see why such arms is given. What aim and object is behind it? I don't understand it. In quantity, it is so huge that we believe it is not necessary. It was up to the Ethiopian regime to settle their problems politically or as they like, mentally oriented, even by their military might or killing as they are accustomed to do. But I don't think that people should come from America or Arab world to fight there. We don't think. What is the need of that? It's a question mark that the history will answer. The aim behind it.
But the entire Horn of Africa sinks at the same time, unfortunately, as a result of that. It sinks as a result of that. And the same can be said of certain South American nations as well. They also take onto the revolutionary, the very appeal of fighting against the system and going against the Western imperial system and no subjugation. It sounds good, and it is good, but in reality there was always a hidden motive behind it. Unfortunately, most of the nations in the Muslim world who took on Soviet assistance used those weapons against their neighbors. Most of them, when they took the weapons, it was only used against their neighbors. That's unfortunate, but that's just the way it turned out to be. In the Middle East, the worst case, Iraq and Iran again, that went on for 8 long years. They lost about 1 million people, soldiers. Neither of them won at the end, but it was being financed and weaponized by the West and East at different levels at different times. And the same in the east in the Horn of Africa as well. Yeah. So this is what happens, unfortunately, when you open your doors to foreign ideology. And when you accept free money and free help, easy money,
Welcome to HistoryUn, the world's leading online learning platform specializing in Islamic history. To discover the HistoryUn mobile app and participate in regular live and interactive seminars and tune in directly from your handset from anywhere in the world. Enjoy instant access to a growing catalog of on-demand streaming content exclusive to the platform, accessible from a variety of devices including desktops, tablets, and cell phones. Connect instantly with our global community of history enthusiasts via our private community forum. To find out more about our online history programs and resources, visit our website today at www.historyun.com.